Hey, I'm Jamie with Stonemaier Games, and today I'm going to talk about my favorite games that have player mats with grids on them that you're filling with stuff. And before I get too far into this, I want to be very clear. I'm talking about games where each player has their own private player mat. That's what I mean when I say player mat, where you're filling a grid, either a hex grid or a square grid or a differently shaped grid on that player mat with different things that result in various benefits. I'm not talking about games where you have a shared board where you're filling a grid or a map on that shared board with other players. I'm talking about private player mats. And mostly today, I'm going to focus on player mats where what's printed on the mat itself has a pretty big impact. There are games that I like that I'll mention in honorable mentions that have grids that you're filling, but it's more about what you're placing on them that matters rather than what's pre-printed on the mat itself. So this is my focus of today's chat. Even as I say that, I'm thinking of another game that I want to add to the list. So our ambassador picks for today. So my ambassadors picked these games at least more than once. A Feast for Odin, Apiary, Agricola, Ark Nova, Azul, Calico, Cartographers, Castles in Burgundy, Harmonies, Guild of Merchant Explorers, The Isle of Cats, My City, Patchwork, Planet Unknown, Sagrada, Tapestry, Tiny Towns, and Vindication. You'll see many of those show up in my top 10 list. And for our panel today, we have a panel of people whose gaming preferences and the way they game are very different than me, and so I want to share some other perspectives on this channel. We'll start with Aryn, and here is Aryn's pick over here. Aryn picked Black Forest as their number one, with their runner-ups being Ark Nova and Apiary. Aryn says about Black Forest, starting with a quaint glass-producing domain, you go from village to gather resources to expand your domain to new heights. Upgrading your glass production expands your domain by adding another small grid to the side of your playmat. Watching my domain grow and grow, building structures, adding or removing forest, boars, and cows never fails to put a smile on my face. At the end of the game, I have a domain that I'm proud of. Even if I don't get a good score, my domain is an accomplishment. I've only played Black Forest once so far, so I don't have a lot to add to what Aryn is saying here. But I agree. I really like the grid in Black Forest. And Aryn talks about something that is overarching about this entire video. I think one of the things that make these player mat grid games really satisfying is that even if you don't score well, even if you don't do well in the game, you have built something in front of you that is yours, that is uniquely yours. And I think that's really wonderful in this style of game. Next up, we have Family Gamer, I believe is next. Yeah, we have Family Gamer Skiler, who has picked Harmonies as their number one. So, and as the runner-ups, Skiler picked Planet Unknown and Captain Flip. This is for family, playing games with your family. And Skiler says for Harmonies, this game has you drafting terrain tokens that you strategically place to have a maximum amount of animals in your habitat. It is elegant and strategic. I agree with Harmonies. This will show up on my honorable mentions a little bit later, not because of how much I enjoy the game, but rather because the grid itself has a very little impact on the gameplay itself. It's more about what you're placing on the grid than what spaces you're filling or not filling on the hex grid itself. So yeah, but I do really appreciate how the grid works in Harmonies, and it's very satisfying to build up this ecosystem on your grid there. Last up, we have our heavy gamer, Carrie, and Carrie has some thoughts about Carnegie here as their number one. Carrie's honorable mentions were The Magnificent and A Feast for Odin. And for Carnegie, Carrie says, the simple choice of where to place a new room tile can affect how easy the room is to use. So the rooms that are harder and further to reach will get you more points. You can see the player mat for Carnegie down here at the bottom. It has these really satisfying tiles that you actually slide out or in depending on how you progress in the game. Really neat mechanism there to have these sliding tiles. So that is Carnegie as Carrie's heavy gamer number one pick. Yeah, let's jump into my honorable mentions. And I actually am going to add one to the list here as I'm talking, because Azul Summer Pavilion didn't come to my mind as being on this list, but Azul Summer Pavilion is a delightful game that I really enjoy. I'm not going to put it too high on this list because it'll be an honorable mention as much as I enjoy the game, because it's more about what you're placing on the map or what's pre-printed on the mat itself. But yeah, Azul Summer Pavilion as one of my honorable mentions. Heaven and Ale, Tiny Towns, Harmonies, as I mentioned before, Agricola and Caverna, My City, and Stamp Swap. Again, all games that I really, really enjoy, but it's more about what you put on the mat than what's pre-printed on the mat itself. Although both are great considerations, in my opinion, for this type of game where you have a player mat where you're filling that grid with different things. Let's jump over, and I did put a few Stonemaier games on this list because I think they do a pretty good job at filling a grid in a satisfying way. And the first of them is Tapestry. So in Tapestry, you have this capital city grid, and the grid actually gets more complex and more asymmetric with some of the expansions with the advanced capital cities. But even the core capital cities, they're all a little bit different in how they're laid out, specifically in terms of which terrain is impassable. So there are certain places where you cannot place buildings. This adds to the puzzle in it. In Tapestry, you're accomplishing a couple different things on the grid. One, whenever you fill a district, a 3x3 square, so the impassable terrains, even though you can't place on them, providing a restriction, they count as pre-filled. So it is a little bit of a benefit. It means that an area like this down here, this district down here has 6 places that are already pre-filled. So you only have to place 3 income buildings there to fill up that district. And when you do, you gain an extra resource. It also has points that you gain for completed rows and columns. And depending on what you unlock in the game, you can score a lot of points or just a little bit of points for completing rows and columns here. Yeah, those are the main ways in the core game of Tapestry that the capital city grid comes into play. There are other asymmetric elements that come into play with the advanced capital cities in the expansions. So that is Tapestry at number 10. At number 9, we have the other Stonemaier game. I put these lower on the list just because I'm showing favoritism to Stonemaier games by even putting them on the list. They probably would be higher if I wasn't wary of that favoritism. But this is our game Apiary from Connie Vogelman. And in Apiary, every player has an asymmetric player mat with a couple different things that you're unlocking on it. So Apiary primarily focuses on when covered benefits. So whenever you cover one of these hexes, whenever you place a hex on top of it, you gain the benefit underneath. It also has ongoing powers based on the tiles that you place there. Again, my focus today is on what's on the player mat, not what's on the tiles themselves. But the ongoing powers do play a pretty big role in Apiary. And crucially, we'll see this in a few of the games on the list today. There are ways to expand your hive ship by adding frame tiles. And whenever you add a frame, not only are you adding a frame and expanding the amount of space that you can fill up, but you also are allowing yourself to gain more seed cards. By default, there are 2 seed cards that you can place, but with each frame, you add another seed card, which are endgame scoring, pretty powerful endgame scoring benefits. Also, I didn't actually note this in my notes, but Apiary also includes a when complete bonus. So at the end of the game, if you fill your hive mat, you get 8 points. And for every frame that you also fill, you get 8 points for that frame. So this is another thing that we'll see throughout this video of when you actually complete a certain area or the entire grid, you get a benefit in Apiary. I put Sagrada at number 8 because Sagrada is not so much about what you're gaining by placing different things on your mat, because the mats don't have like instant benefits that you're gaining from filling them. But they do have the puzzle is what's actually pre-printed on your mat itself. So for example, this mat's pretty full, but you can see down here, you must place a yellow die on that spot. Up here, you must place a 5 value die on that spot. And that puzzle relates to which other dice that you place around it, because the dice that you place next to these spaces cannot be the same color. So if I place a yellow die next to this space down here, I cannot then place a yellow die on the space. That is the general rule for placing dice in Sagrada. So in Sagrada, it adds these restrictions that make the puzzle interesting, and that puzzle gets even more complex and difficult depending on the player mat that you choose and how many different numbers and colors are pre-printed on the player mat itself. A lot of variety comes from Sagrada in that way. And the different scoring does emerge from it as well. Each player has like a different scoring card where they want to have a certain dice, more dice of a certain color. There are also goals that you're pursuing. But just by default, I think the grid itself in Sagrada provides an interesting spatial placement puzzle. That is Sagrada at number 8. At number 7, we have the Guild of Merchant Explorers. Looks like I didn't choose an image for this. Here we go. Here is the Guild of Merchant Explorers. This game does something a little bit unique compared to pretty much any of these other games, which is that the grid that you start to fill up in the Guild of Merchant Explorers, parts of the tokens, or many of the tokens that you place, go away at the end of the round. All of these cubes that are out here that this player has placed, they actually go away at the end of the round. They disappear, and only the cities, I believe they're called, remain. And so that is unique in itself. How you get the cities is that you fill up. I believe it's, I should have looked this up in advance. I think it's that you have at least 3 tokens, 3 cubes sharing the same territory along with the city. I should have looked that up specifically. But when you have a certain number of tokens together in the same space, they form a city, and the cities don't go away. So there's little like when complete bonuses that really add to the persistent elements of the game, opposed to the cubes that are just going to go away afterwards. There's also a bunch of when covered benefits on these maps. So you have coins that you can gain, there are towers that you can gain, all these different when covered benefits that you can gain depending on which direction you stretch out on this map. And also the maps are vastly different. They aren't different per player. Every player always plays with the same map in Guild of Merchant Explorers, but each map adds a very different spatial puzzle to the game that I really enjoy. That's why I picked the Guild of Merchant Explorers at number 7. At number 6, I picked A Feast for Odin. This game does a couple different things that I think are really satisfying in terms of filling the grid. One is it has penalties that you suffer if you don't cover them. You can see your grid is filled with negative points, and so it gives you a strong incentive to cover all these negative points by the end of the game so you don't score negative points. The game also gives you opportunities for income. So the income is shown with a hand here. So if you filled the grid, you have to start down at the very bottom where the income starts, and you have to fill the grid kind of from bottom left up to the upper right, unlocking, covering, and then unlocking different income. So this says at the beginning of this round, you'll gain 6 coins because of how far I've come with the income so far. There's also income benefits that you can gain by surrounding them. So when surrounded, I don't think I've talked about this yet. There are benefits that when you completely surround it, you gain that benefit. I believe it's been a little while since I played Feast for Odin. It's either an instant benefit or an income benefit. I can't remember. Either way, it's a good benefit to gain from a when surrounded element in this game, in A Feast for Odin. And then even more on top of this in A Feast for Odin, you can add additional maps. And I don't mean like new maps that you add from game to game. It means that you can go exploring and go to a completely new island, and you add that island tile to your tableau, and that gives you a whole new grid to fill up and get new bonuses and get new income. I think that's really cool to add that potential to add new islands, that choice. You don't have to do it, but you can go exploring and add new islands. You're adding new negative points in the short term, but hopefully you'll be able to cover them by the end of the game, which is very satisfying in A Feast for Odin. And I think really adds to the theme of exploring in the game. So that is A Feast for Odin at number 6. At number 5, we have Cartographers. Here's a beautifully colored in map that someone made. Cartographers has a vast variety of maps that add different spatial puzzles, but the key in Cartographers is a combination of when you orthogonally surround these mountains, you get a coin, and that coin is a point for the rest of the game every time you score. So if you surround one of these mountains early, you're scoring that coin 4 times over the course of the game, which can feel really good. But also all the other spatial puzzles in Cartographers come from not necessarily what's default printed on your mat itself, but what comes up in the scoring cards. And this is, I could have stretched this probably to Stamp Swap and some other games too, but I think Cartographers does it particularly well by giving you these goals, these when completed, and kind of just how big their size-based goals. How big can you make this village? How big can you make this forest? And it might have a certain requirements where it has to touch the left edge and the bottom edge. These come from the cards in the game, and they score twice over the course of the game. So I think Cartographers does a great job at a variety of completion and size-based goals in the game, even though they aren't printed on the mat itself. That is Cartographers at number 5. At number 4, we have the Castles of Burgundy. This is probably the game that got me thinking the most about this topic because it is really, really satisfying to cover these grids. And these grids aren't all that complex in what's pre-printed on the grid itself. It's just a bunch of different areas with dice on them. So there's a requirement. You need a certain die to place a hex on that tile, and you need the hex in the first place to place on that tile. But I think that the thing that really stands out about Castles of Burgundy are these areas that you're trying to complete. Especially paired with the idea that each of the tiles in the game feels very different. Blue tiles do different things than green tiles. So you pursuing an early strategy to complete a red area, a smaller red area, to gain points will give you a different feel than if you had a different mat where a smaller area might be green and you pursue that because you're getting different tiles associated with that area. These two mats look the same, but it's a big stack because there are so many actual different grids that you can get in Castles of Burgundy that add different puzzles to the game. In fact, the mat printed here is a different mat itself. But the one other thing I wanted to highlight here about Castles of Burgundy is that when you do complete an area, you get points based off of what round it is. So there's a strong incentive to finish finish areas as soon as possible because you get more points for doing so in the game. So that is Castles of Burgundy at number 4. At number 3, we have the Isle of Cats. Again, each player has a pretty different ship in Isle of Cats, and you're trying to cover this ship with polyomino tiles. And there's a couple different benefits built into the ship itself. One is rats. You're trying to cover up the rats because they're worth negative points at the end of the game. There's also rooms. So, for example, this is a room right here. You get this is a negative point game, kind of like a Feast for Odin. For every room that you don't complete, you get -5 points. You're also trying to connect cat families, which is not pre-printed on the map, but it adds an interesting puzzle in the game where you're trying to find cats of the same color and have them connected throughout the ship, which is a puzzle that is sometimes in opposition of some of these other goals of completing a room or covering a rat. Last, there are these when covered benefits of the maps. Whenever you cover a map, you get I believe it's either a rare treasure or just a treasure right away when you cover that map. You get a special bonus when you cover a map. And then on top of all this, kind of like cartographers, there are all these other goals that you can get, that you can draft in the game that give you benefits if you do certain things. Like if you cover all edge spaces on the map or all interior spaces, give you different goals as to what you are incentivized to cover on this ship. That is the Isle of Cats at number 3. At number 2, we have Ark Nova. Here is part of a player mat in Ark Nova. You're using these tiles that are a little bit tough to grok. I think it's easier to grok or to understand where to place and how to place polyomino tiles. These are hex-shaped polyomino tiles. And in Ark Nova, there's, again, a vast variety of play mats that you can use. Some of them simpler, some of them more complex. There's a when complete benefit in Ark Nova, where if you fill your entire mat, you get 7 points or 7 income, I believe. There's also when covered benefits. Whenever you cover these benefits, you get 5 coins, you get one of these tokens. There are impassable terrain. You can't place tokens on top of the stone or water, but there are certain animals that want to be near stone or water, so you have to keep an eye on that. And also there are spaces not visible on this mat in particular, but there are places, there are impassable terrain spaces that you can only place on top of if you've unlocked the building card or if you've upgraded the building action card that you have. So I think that's needed. That's somewhat unique, I think, to this game, that you have to unlock that card. You have to upgrade that card before you can even place on certain terrains. And that, I think, is a neat thing in general, to have a mat with impassable terrain. But if you upgrade something to a certain level, then that terrain is no longer impassable. I think that's neat. So that is Ark Nova at number 2. At number 1, though, we have Planet Unknown, for which I forgot to pick a mat to highlight. Here's a mat that we can look at. So there are, again, a vast variety of planets in Planet Unknown. I have mainly played with the standard planet and still had a ton of fun with it. I mentioned that whenever I talk about Planet Unknown. So I think the variety is great, but not necessarily needed. In fact, this looks like a prototype copy because I don't think the cubes are in the final game. But on these mats in Planet Unknown, you're placing tiles, and you were trying to fill up rows and columns. You get points for rows and columns, but you're also trying to avoid certain spaces and place on top of certain spaces to gain these tokens. These blue tokens here are tokens that you want to gain by placing these polyomino tiles on top of them. So it's just, I'm probably a little biased here in terms of how much I love this game, but in terms of why I placed it at number 1. But it does scratch a lot of these itches of rows and columns completed. So when completing certain areas, gaining tokens by covering different areas on the mat, and also the vast variety of asymmetric mats included in Planet Unknown. And that's why Planet Unknown is my number 1 on this list. So really, this is overall a checklist of at least 10 different things that you can, different elements that you can pre-print on player mat grids that can give players a ton of different decisions to think about as they are placing tokens on those grids. Just a neat toolbox to play around with if you're creating a game that has player mats with their own little grids to fill up with different sized and shaped tokens and tiles. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have a different game or something that I missed here that you can do with player mat grids that I didn't mention in the video, let me know about that in the comments below, or let me know your number 1 game that has a player mat grid or that really features a player mat grid. Thanks.